Hello children, in today's class we are going to see Coleridge's Biographia Literaria in detail. That is chapter 14 we are going to see in detail in today's class. So I am going to tell you a very interesting story today. Listen carefully. See, Biographia Literaria chapter 14 actually begins by narrating the story of the birth of lyrical ballads. So many of you would not know the story behind this popular famous book Lyrical Ballads. Lyrical Ballads, which was published in the year 1798. So now I am going to tell you how this Lyrical Ballads came out. Okay, that is when Coleridge and Wordsworth were neighbors, they frequently talked about two important points about poetry. So first they discussed the reproduction of objects supplied by a faithful observation of external world by the poet. And the second thing that they discussed was, how poetry modifies this true representation, that is the faithful observation. So how poetry modifies this true representation of objects by the poetic imagination, and so invests them with beauty and novelty. So these are two things which they frequently discussed. So they had out how the transforming effect of imagination was suggested to them by the operation of moonlight. Okay, so this fascination, this was the fascination for them. This operation of moonlight was one fascination for them. And the second is this sunset glow. So these two, moonlight, it is operation of moonlight and the sunset glow, these two imparts, if you see, strange charm and mystery to the familiar objects of nature. So sun is a familiar object, the sunset, and also this moonlight. All these two are actually familiar objects, but they want to study how these two impart strange charm and mystery. So it was therefore decided that Coleridge would compose poems in which the incidents and agents would be supernatural. Okay, so this was decided, fixed. So Coleridge would focus upon the incidents and agents which are supernatural. That is, they would be, and those supernatural images would be rendered or would be made interesting by giving them the emotions and behaviors peculiar to human being. So this was actually the project assigned to Coleridge, or sometimes we do not know, he would have volunteered to work on this. And next, so that is what I have put here. That is, his duty was, to make unfamiliar familiar. That was Coleridge's duty. Next, coming to Wordsworth. Wordsworth actually, on the contrary, was to compose poems dealing with events and characters which every village may supply to a man of alert mind. Okay, that is, he decides to make familiar unfamiliar. So these are the two projects that they plan to work on. So Coleridge's duty is to make unfamiliar familiar, and Wordsworth's duty is to make familiar unfamiliar in this preface. So Coleridge to make, as I said, familiar unfamiliar familiar. So in this way, two poets commenced to work, and Coleridge composed the Ancient Mariner, and he proceeded with the writing of the famous book, The Dark Lady and Christabel, where the supernatural elements was to be treated with greater subtlety and effectiveness. And Coleridge suddenly he realized that Wordsworth was working with such an industry and speed, and he feared that his own poems would be out of place, because Wordsworth worked with in such a speed that Coleridge could not keep pace with him. And Wordsworth also, added a series of poems dealing with rustic life and characters, and also 2 or 3 poems in his own character, that is Wordsworth's own character, marked by the dignity of thought and the stateliness of manner, which are peculiar to Wordsworth's own genius. So now you know what happens to Coleridge, because he has produced only three works, that is the Dark Lady, Christabel, and the Ancient Marina. Okay, so 2 years later, preface was added. But before it, in this work, in this form, that is the first work, in the same form, that is the first edition of the Lyrical Ballads was published. And it was published with a brief advertisement which pointed out that the poems that they have written were the product of an experiment to see. So we know, we have already seen the experiment. So what is the experiment? So Coleridge's duty is to make unfamiliar familiar and Wordsworth's familiar unfamiliar. So they attached an advertisement to the first edition of Lyrical Ballads stating that it was an experiment to see how, far poems representing ordinary incidents and characters in a simple and colloquial language can impart that pleasure to the readers which poetry is generally expected to provide. Okay, so that they expressed that was their intention. So 2 years later, if you see, that is in the year 1800, that is Lyrical Ballads was published in the year 1798. 2 years later, in 1800, the second edition of the Lyrical Ballads in 2 volumes was brought out, and to it was prefixed a lengthy preface. So that is what we say preface to. Lyrical Ballads was published in the year 1800. So a lengthy preface was added in the year 1800, and in the preface it was asserted that the language actually spoken by peasants and rustics has been used for all kinds of poetry, and that such a language is the fittest and most effective medium. So this was the statement made in the preface. Okay, so what was the statement? See, language actually spoken by peasants has been used for all kinds of poetry, and that language is the fittest. What language? Which language? The language spoken by peasants is the fittest and most effective medium. So this sweeping assertion actually stirred up a heated and prolonged controversy, which has continued ever since. So in preface, if you see, in spite of all hostile criticism, after the publication of the Lyrical Ballads, or the preface have not only survived but have steadily grown up in popularity, not merely with readers of lower classes but also with young men of acute sensibility and cultured minds. In spite of all these hostile criticism, we do not know the reason for this popularity. Okay, so coming to the chapter lesson. So the intellectual energy and the genius of the poet displayed in the poems of the poet, particularly Wordsworth. Okay, we are talking about Wordsworth now. So the intellectual energy and genius of Wordsworth displayed in his poems was such that even his critics and scoffers were impressed by it. So Coleridge has complained regarding that statement. Okay, that sweeping statement. He was not okay with the sweeping statement made by Wordsworth. So he says that even Wordsworth himself did not, not Wordsworth, Coleridge himself did not agree with many parts of Wordsworth's preface, and he made a bold statement. He is bold enough to point out that Wordsworth's principles were wrong. And he said that even Wordsworth's principles were contradictory to not only to other parts of preface but also to the practice of the poet himself in most of the poems. And next, his complaint is, as Coleridge's own name has been frequently mentioned by the critics along with that of Wordsworth as the co-writer of the preface, he deems it proper to declare in which parts he agrees with Wordsworth and in which he does not do so. So this is the reason for him to write this Biographia Literaria. So they had they had, disagreements when they wrote or when they published preface and lyrical ballads. And now he wants to make it, Coleridge wants to make it clear to the writers and also to the critics, in which he, that is Coleridge, does agree with Wordsworth and in which he does not do so. But in order to facilitate an understanding of Coleridge's views, he must explain his views first, right? So he thought that to make people understand his views, he wanted to explain first what is poem and secondly what is poetry. So he says, Coleridge says, poem and poetry are not same. Okay, poem, and though we use it interchangeably, according to Coleridge, poem is different from poetry. So he wants to make it clear to his readers and critics his views regarding poem and poetry. So now we are going to see what is poem and what is poetry according to Coleridge.